Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The mist hung heavy in the air, wrapping the ancient trees in a shroud of mystery. The forest was alive with the soft rustling of leaves and the distant calls of unseen creatures. Carl trudged forward, his breath coming in labored gasps, the weight of his armor pressing down on him like an iron shackle. The battle had been fierce, and though he had survived, it had taken everything he had. Now, he was lost, disoriented in a place that seemed to defy the natural order. The forest was unlike any he had ever seen. The trees were impossibly tall, their branches twisting and curling in ways that made them look more like the gnarled fingers of some ancient giant than ordinary wood. The ground was soft underfoot, almost as if it were alive, pulsing gently with each step he took. Carl tightened his grip on his sword, the familiar weight a small comfort in this strange place that he had no idea how long he had been wandering. Time seemed to stretch and warp here, hours feeling like minutes and minutes like days. His thoughts drifted to his comrades, the men he had fought alongside, their faces a blur of blood and pain. They were gone now, lost in the chaos of the battle. And here he was, alone, with no clear path back to his world. Just as despair began to gnaw at the edges of his mind, Carl saw it. At first, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him, but as he drew closer, he realized it was real. An inn, standing tall and imposing in the middle of the forest. It was an odd sight, out of place in the wild, untamed woods. The inn was grand, with tall spindly towers that reached into the sky, their peaks disappearing into the thick mist above. The walls were dark and weathered, made of stone that seemed to absorb the light around it. Despite its intimidating appearance, Carl felt an inexplicable pull toward it, as if some unseen force was guiding his steps. He hesitated for a moment, then pushed open the heavy wooden door. It creaked on its hinges, revealing a dimly lit interior. The air inside was warm, a stark contrast to the cool dampness of the forest outside. The inn was eerily quiet, the only sound the soft crackling of a fire in the large stone hearth. As Carl stepped inside, the door closed behind him with a soft thud. He turned quickly, his hand instinctively reaching for his sword, but there was no one there. The inn seemed empty, though it was clear that someone, or something, had been here recently. The fire was fresh, the embers glowing brightly, and the room was tidy, as if expecting guests. "Welcome, traveler." The voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it echoed through the inn with a power that belied its quiet tone. Carl spun around to see an old man standing at the far end of the room. He was tall and thin, with a long white beard that reached down to his chest. His eyes were sharp, glittering with an intelligence that made Carl uneasy. The old man was dressed in simple robes, the fabric a deep, rich blue that seemed to shimmer in the firelight. "Who are you?" Carl asked, his voice hoarse from the long journey. The old man smiled, a knowing, almost amused smile. "I am Alaric, the keeper of this inn." "And you, young warrior, are Carl, are you not?" Carl stiffened at the mention of his name. "How do you know me?" "I know many things," Alaric replied, his eyes twinkling with mischief. "This inn is a special place, you see. It exists between worlds, a sanctuary for those who are lost, like yourself." Carl frowned, his grip tightening on the hilt of his sword. "I'm not lost," he said, though the words rang hollow even to his own ears. "Of course not," Alaric said, inclining his head slightly. "But perhaps you are searching for something, yes? Something you lost along the way." Carl hesitated, unsure of how to respond. There was something unsettling about this man, something that set his instincts on edge. But there was also something compelling, something that made him want to trust Alaric, despite his misgivings. I need to get back to my world, Carl said finally. My comrades, they need me. Alaric's expression softened, a hint of sadness in his eyes. Ah, yes. The bonds of duty and honor. They weigh heavily on you, don't they? But the path back to your world is not a simple one. You must first prove yourself worthy, pass the tests that lie ahead. Tests? Carl echoed, a knot of unease forming in his stomach. What kind of tests? The kind that reveal your true self, Alaric said cryptically. Come, I will show you. Without waiting for a response, Alaric turned and began walking toward a staircase at the far end of the room. Carl hesitated, then followed, his senses on high alert. The stairs were narrow and steep, winding upward in a spiral that made Carl's head spin. The walls were lined with portraits, each one depicting a different scene, but all with the same central figure, a warrior, standing alone against impossible odds. Finally, they reached the top of the stairs, and Alaric led Carl down a long, dimly lit hallway. Doors lined both sides, each one identical to the last, made of dark wood with iron handles. Alaric stopped in front of one and turned to Carl. This is your first test, he said, his voice solemn. What lies beyond this door is for you alone to face. Remember, the challenges are not meant to be easy, but they are necessary if you wish to find your way back. Carl nodded, his jaw set in determination. He had faced danger before, and he would face it again if it meant finding his way home. Without another word, he reached for the handle and pushed the door open. The room was small and bare, the only furniture a single, large mirror that stood in the center. The mirror was ancient, its frame ornately carved with symbols that seemed to pulse with a faint, eerie light. The air in the room was heavy, charged with a strange energy that made the hairs on the back of Carl's neck stand on end. He stepped closer, his reflection coming into view. But as he stared into the mirror, he realized with a start that the reflection was not quite his own. The figure in the mirror was him, but different. The reflection's eyes were darker, its expression twisted into a sneer of disdain. Carl's heart pounded in his chest as he took a step back, but the reflection did not move. It stood there, staring back at him with a malevolent grin. Who are you? Carl demanded, his voice echoing in the empty room. The reflection chuckled, a cold, mocking sound. I am you, Carl. Or rather, I am the part of you that you try to hide, the part you fear the most. Carl's blood ran cold. That's not true. I'm not afraid. Oh, but you are, the reflection taunted, its grin widening. You're afraid of failure, of letting down those who depend on you. You carry the weight of your fallen comrades on your shoulders, but deep down, you know that you're not strong enough to bear it. You're weak, Carl. Just like the rest of them. Shut up. Carl shouted, drawing his sword. The reflection only laughed, a harsh, grating sound that grated on Carl's nerves. Do you really think you can fight me? The reflection sneered. You can't escape from yourself, Carl. You can't run from the truth. Carl's grip tightened on his sword, his knuckles white. He lunged at the mirror, swinging his blade with all his might. But the reflection moved with impossible speed, dodging the attack and striking back with a force that sent Carl stumbling backward. You're a fool, the reflection hissed, its voice filled with venom. You think you can defeat me with brute force? You're only fighting yourself. Carl struggled to his feet, his chest heaving with exertion. The reflection loomed over him, its eyes glowing with a dark, malevolent light. You can't win, it said, its voice low and menacing. You're not strong enough. You'll never be strong enough. Carl's mind raced, panic rising in his throat. The reflection was right, he couldn't defeat it, not like this. He was fighting a battle he couldn't win, a battle against his own doubts and fears, but then, a thought occurred to him. What if he didn't have to fight? What if the key to winning wasn't defeating the reflection, but accepting it? Carl took a deep breath, lowering his sword. The reflection paused, its sneer faltering for the first time. "What are you doing?" it demanded, its voice laced with confusion. "I'm not afraid," Carl said, his voice steady. "I've made mistakes, and I've lost people I care about. But that doesn't make me weak. It makes me human." The reflection's eyes widened, its form flickering like a candle in the wind. "I accept who I am," Carl continued, his voice growing stronger. "I accept my flaws, my fears, my failures. They don't define me, they make me stronger." The reflection let out a shriek of rage, its form distorting and twisting in agony. Carl watched as it writhed and flickered, the dark energy that had once fueled it dissipating into the air. Finally, with a final, ear-splitting scream, the reflection shattered into 1,000 pieces, the mirror exploding in a burst of light. Carl shielded his eyes from the blinding light, his heart pounding in his chest. When he finally lowered his arm, he found himself standing in an empty room, the shattered remains of the mirror scattered at his feet. The door at the far end of the room creaked open, revealing a narrow hallway beyond. Carl let out a shaky breath, his body trembling with exhaustion. The first test was over, but he knew there were more to come. He stepped through the door, the hallway closing behind him with a soft click. The hallway was long and winding, the walls lined with flickering torches that cast eerie shadows on the stone floor. Carl walked cautiously, his senses on high alert. He didn't know what to expect next, but he knew that Alaric's tests were far from over. After what felt like an eternity, Carl reached the end of the hallway and found himself standing in front of another door. He hesitated for a moment, then pushed it open, stepping into the room beyond. The air was thick with mist, the room filled with towering trees that seemed to stretch up into the sky. The ground was soft and spongy underfoot, covered in a thick layer of moss and fallen leaves. The trees were ancient, their trunks gnarled and twisted, their branches covered in a dense tangle of vines. Carl took a step forward, his eyes scanning the forest for any sign of danger. The air was filled with the soft rustling of leaves and the distant calls of birds, but there was something else, too, an eerie whispering that seemed to come from all around him. "Who's there?" Carl called out, his voice echoing through the forest. The whispering grew louder, the voices overlapping and intertwining in a chaotic chorus. "Turn back," one voice whispered. "Stay with us," another murmured. "Follow me," a third voice urged. Carl's heart pounded in his chest as he tried to make sense of the voices. They seemed to be coming from all directions, pulling him in different ways. He felt a rising sense of panic, unsure of which voice to trust. The forest was playing tricks on his mind, creating illusions that made it impossible to tell what was real and what wasn't. The voices grew louder, more insistent, until they were a deafening roar in his ears. Carl squeezed his eyes shut, trying to drown out the noise. He couldn't let the forest get to him, couldn't let it break his focus. He had to find a way out, had to keep moving forward. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to calm down. The voices were trying to distract him, to lead him astray. He couldn't let them win. He opened his eyes and looked around, searching for something, anything, that could guide him, and then he saw it, a faint light, flickering in the distance. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there, cutting through the darkness like a beacon. Carl began to move toward the light, his steps slow and deliberate. The voices grew more frantic, more desperate, but he ignored them, keeping his focus on the light. The forest seemed to shift and warp around him, the trees twisting and bending in impossible ways, but Carl kept his eyes on the light, refusing to be swayed. As he drew closer, the light grew brighter, until it was almost blinding in its intensity. The voices reached a fever pitch, screaming and wailing in his ears, but Carl pressed on, his determination unwavering. Finally, he reached the source of the light, a small clearing in the middle of the forest. The light was coming from a single, glowing orb that hovered in the center of the clearing, its soft, ethereal glow illuminating the area around it. Carl approached the orb cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the energy emanating from it, a strange, almost otherworldly force that made the hairs on his arms stand on end. As he reached out to touch the orb, the voices suddenly went silent, the forest falling into an eerie, unnatural stillness. Carl hesitated for a moment, then steeled himself and placed his hand on the orb. The world around him seemed to explode in a burst of light and sound. Carl felt himself being pulled in all directions, his mind bombarded with images and sensations that he couldn't fully comprehend. The light grew brighter and brighter, until it was almost unbearable, and then, just as suddenly, it stopped. Carl opened his eyes, blinking against the sudden darkness. The forest was gone, replaced by a large, ornate hall filled with countless doors. The walls were lined with tapestries depicting scenes of great battles, of heroes and villains, of triumph and tragedy. The air was heavy with the scent of old wood and musty fabric, and the only sound was the soft crackling of a fire in the hearth. Alaric stood at the far end of the hall, his expression unreadable. "You have done well, Carl," he said, his voice echoing through the hall. "But your journey is not yet over. You must now make a choice." Carl frowned, his eyes scanning the countless doors that lined the walls. "What kind of choice?" he asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "Each door represents a different path, a different destiny," Alaric explained. "Some doors lead to great rewards, others to terrible dangers. Some lead to new worlds, others back to your own. You must choose the door that will lead you to your true destiny." Carl's heart sank at the thought of making such a monumental decision. There were so many doors, so many possibilities. How was he supposed to know which one to choose? Alaric seemed to sense his hesitation. "Remember what you have learned, Carl," he said, his voice gentle. "The tests you have faced have prepared you for this moment. Trust in yourself, and the choice will become clear." Carl took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He closed his eyes and focused on the lessons he had learned during his journey. He had faced his fears, navigated the illusions of the forest, and accepted his own flaws. He had proven that he was strong, not just in body, but in spirit as well. With newfound confidence, Carl opened his eyes and began to walk down the hall. The doors seemed to blur together, their shapes and colors shifting as he passed. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him, but he didn't let it deter him. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Carl stopped in front of a door. It was unremarkable, its wood plain and unadorned, with no markings to distinguish it from the others. But something about it felt right, felt like it was the door he was meant to choose. Without hesitation, Carl reached out and turned the handle. The door swung open silently, revealing a dark, circular chamber beyond. Carl stepped through the doorway, the door closing behind him with a soft click. The chamber was vast and empty, its walls lined with ancient runes that glowed faintly in the dim light. In the center of the room stood a single pedestal, on which rested a glowing orb similar to the one he had seen in the forest. Alaric appeared beside the pedestal, his expression solemn. "This is your final test, Carl," he said. "The orb contains the essence of your destiny. To return to your world, you must place your hand on it and accept your fate. But be warned, the orb will show you the truth, both of your past and your future. It will reveal what could have been and what may yet come to pass. Carl felt a shiver run down his spine. The idea of seeing his fate laid out before him was both terrifying and exhilarating. But he knew he had come too far to turn back now. Whatever the orb showed him, he would face it head-on. He approached the pedestal, his heart pounding in his chest. The orb pulsed with a soft, ethereal light, its surface smooth and cool to the touch. Carl took a deep breath, steeling himself, and placed his hand on the orb. The chamber was suddenly filled with light, blindingly bright, and Carl was pulled into a whirlwind of images and sensations. He saw flashes of his past, his childhood, his training as a warrior, the battles he had fought, and the comrades he had lost. He saw himself standing in front of the mirror, confronting his reflection, and navigating the forest of echoes, but then the images shifted, showing him visions of what could have been. He saw himself in a different life, a life where he had chosen a different path. He saw himself as a farmer, tending to crops and raising a family. He saw himself as a scholar, poring over ancient texts and unlocking the secrets of the universe. He saw himself as a leader, guiding his people through times of great peril, and then the images changed again, showing him glimpses of the future, his future. He saw himself standing on a battlefield, leading his comrades to victory. He saw himself in a grand hall, receiving honors for his bravery. He saw himself in a quiet moment, surrounded by friends and loved ones, at peace with himself and the world. The images were overwhelming, a flood of emotions and possibilities that threatened to drown him. But Carl held on, grounding himself in the present, in who he was and what he had learned. The future was uncertain, and the past was unchangeable, but he had the power to shape his own destiny. Finally, the light began to fade, and the images slowed to a stop. Carl found himself back in the chamber, his hand still resting on the orb. He felt different, stronger, more at peace. The tests had changed him, had given him a deeper understanding of himself and his place in the world. Alaric smiled, a look of pride in his eyes. "You have done well, Carl," he said. "You have faced your fears, accepted your flaws, and embraced your destiny. You are ready to return to your world." Carl nodded, a sense of calm washing over him. He was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, ready to take control of his fate. He had come to the inn lost and uncertain, but he was leaving it a changed man. The chamber began to fade, the walls and floor dissolving into light. Carl felt a familiar tug at his core, the sensation of being pulled through space and time. He closed his eyes, letting the light envelop him. When he opened his eyes again, he was standing in the middle of the forest, the inn nowhere to be seen. The mist had lifted, the trees bathed in the soft light of dawn. The air was crisp and cool, filled with the scent of pine and earth. Carl took a deep breath, savoring the feeling of solid ground beneath his feet. He was back in his world, but he was not the same man who had entered the inn. He had faced his demons, navigated impossible challenges, and emerged stronger for it. As he began to make his way through the forest, Carl felt a sense of peace that he hadn't felt in a long time. The journey ahead would be difficult, but he was no longer afraid. He knew who he was, and he knew what he was capable of. The forest gradually gave way to open fields, the sun rising higher in the sky. Carl walked with purpose, his steps confident and sure. He had passed the tests, uncovered the secrets of the mysterious inn, and found his way back to his world. But more importantly, he had found his way back to himself.